No dogs. No exceptions. The young manager said it twice, the second time louder, so the whole room would hear she meant it. The man she said it to was 68. In a wheelchair, 2 prosthetic legs folded beneath the table, faded service vest on the Belgian Malinois at his wheel. He didn't argue. He simply nodded once, the way men nod when they've heard worse from better, and turned his chair toward the door. Forks kept moving. Nobody stood up for him. And at the counter, an old man in a brown coat nodded along, agreeing, no idea that in 4 minutes his heart would stop, and that the only thing in that diner trained to save him was the animal being thrown out. Quiet man's dignity is worth more than a rule. Type honour in the comments. His name was Earl Mercer. Most people in Calhoun County had no idea who he was, which was exactly how he liked it. He lived 9 miles out on a gravel road, in a single-story house, with a wheelchair ramp he'd built himself, badly, the slope a few degrees too steep, so that he had to fight it every morning and every night. He was the kind of man you'd pass at the hardware store, and forget by the time you reached your truck. Broad through the shoulders still, though the rest of him had gone lean, the way old soldiers go lean, like the body had decided to keep only what it needed. He wore the same grey canvas jacket in every season. He kept his hair high and tight out of habit, 40 years deep, though it had gone the colour of wood smoke. And he had a way of holding himself, even in the chair, that made you think of a man standing at attention. Spine straight, chin level, hands quiet. People mistook the stillness for coldness. It wasn't discipline. Worn so long, it had become the shape of him. Below the knees there was nothing of the legs he'd been born with. He had 2 prosthetics, carbon and titanium, that he strapped on every morning and could walk on for short distances when the stumps weren't raw, a wheelchair for the days they were. That afternoon they were raw. He'd known they would be, and he'd come into town anyway, because it was the 11th, and on the 11th of every month he ate a cheeseburger at a diner with the dog. Nothing in heaven or on earth had ever talked him out of a thing he'd decided to do. What no one in that diner could have guessed, watching an old man in a wheelchair get turned away from a table, was that the tremor in his left hand, the one resting on the dog's shoulder, had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the brass tag clipped inside the dog's vest, a tag that did not belong to this dog at all. Dog's name was Rook. He was 4 years old, sable and black, 65 pounds of muscle that knew how to be still, and he wore a service vest, so faded you could barely read the patches. The vest was older than he was. It had belonged to another dog. Earl had it restitched twice, and never once considered buying a new one, because sewn into the lining, on a small brass tag worn smooth at the edges, was a single word and a single year. Duke, 2004. Rook had never been to war. He'd been born in a kennel in Tennessee, and raised on a gravel road in Calhoun County by a man with no legs who had spent 2 years teaching him a sequence of movements most people would never see when he knee, and would not understand if they did. Earl had run that sequence for 8 years in the worst districts around Kandahar, with a dog named Duke, and when Duke died of old age in Earl's lap on a kitchen floor, Earl had decided the sequence would not die with him, so he taught it again. He taught it to a puppy, and on a Tuesday afternoon in a roadside diner, in front of 40 strangers who thought he was nobody, Puppy was about to use it. Morning on the gravel road went the same way every day, and the sameness was the point. Earl woke before the light, because his body still kept a soldier's hours, and he lay there a moment, letting the day arrive before he reached, for the legs propped against the nightstand. There was a ritual to putting them on. The liners, the sleeves, the careful seat of carbonhouse against bone, and there was a ritual to taking the first steps, the testing of the floor, The small private negotiation between a man and the parts of him that had been built in a lab. Rook was always already awake, sitting in the doorway, watching. Because the dog had learned that the worst mornings were the ones where Earl sat too, long on the edge of the bed with his hands over his face. And on those mornings the dog would come and put his big head in Earl's lap and stay until the man's breathing evened out. Then they would go out into the cold and run the sequence. Every single day, rain or shine, raw stumps or not, they ran it in the yard behind the house. The find, the roll, the chest, 3 and 3 bark, until it lived in the dog's blood the way it lived in Earl's. Neighbours who didn't know better thought the old man out there in the half-dark, dropping commands to a dog over a dummy on the frost, had lost a few screws. The ones who knew what he'd been didn't think anything of the kind. They thought he was the sanest man in the county. They were right. The diner was the reward at the end of the discipline, and the 11th was the day he allowed himself the reward. Most months he could walk in on the legs. Slow but upright, the dog matched to his pace. This month the stumps were too raw for the sockets, so it was the chair, and the chair always drew more eyes, because a wheelchair makes people look, and a cane does not. That was a thing he'd noticed, years ago, and stopped being bothered by. He'd learned to let the looking slide off him. He was a man who had been stared at by people trying to kill him. The curiosity of strangers in a diner could not reach him, what he could not have known. Rolling through Rudy's door that afternoon, 2 fingers resting out of habit on Rook's shoulder, post, was that the discipline of all those cold mornings was about to be tested in front of witnesses, and that everything he'd refused to let die on a gravel road was about to prove why he'd kept it alive. The diner was called Rudy's, and it sat at the seam where the county highway met the interstate ramp, a low brick building, with a buzzing neon sign that had been missing its second R since the Clinton administration. Inside it smelled like coffee scorched on the burner and bacon grease, and the pink soap they used on the tables. The lunch crowd was the usual truckers killing an hour, a road crew in reflective vests, 2 booths of retirees who came for the senior special and stayed for the company, scattering of locals who treated the place like a second kitchen. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A small television above the register played a muted weather report nobody watched. On the wall behind the counter, between a fire department calendar and a corkboard of business cards, hung a small American flag and a yellowed photograph of the original Rudy, dead 20 years, who had hung a sign by the door that still said, "Everyone's welcome," in hand-painted letters going grey. Nobody had taken it down. Nobody had read it lately either. And the woman who ran the floor that afternoon had walked past those words 100 times without once letting them mean anything, which was about to cost her more than she could imagine. The afternoon had the particular rhythm of a roadside diner, past the lunch rush and short of the dinner crowd. The lull where the work slows but never stops, where the coffee gets refilled out of habit, and the conversations stretch long. Road crew at the corner booth argued good-naturedly about a ball game. One of the retirees told a story everyone at his table had heard before, and they let him tell it anyway, because that was the kindness of regulars. Carla moved between the tables with the unhurried economy of a woman who'd walked 10,000 miles across that same checkered floor, refilling here, clearing there, calling half the room by name. The cook tapped his spatula against the flat top in a rhythm only he heard. It was, in every way that mattered, an ordinary afternoon at an ordinary place. The kind of hour that would have evaporated from everyone's memory by the next morning. If it had been allowed to stay ordinary, it would not be. Something was already moving toward Rudy's that none of them could see. Old man's failing artery, and a young woman's fear, and a wheelchair turning off the highway. 3 things converging on the same square of floor at the same minute. And the only person in the building who would know what to do when they collided was the one nobody in the room had bothered to look at twice. Her name was Megan Doss, and she was 26, and she was holding her life together with both hands. She was 3 semesters into a nursing degree. She paid for 1 course at a time, working doubles at Rudy's to cover tuition, and the rent on an apartment she shared with a roommate who'd stopped paying her half. Host. She was pretty, in the tired way of someone who hadn't slept enough in a year, and she carried herself with the brittle authority of a person who had been put in charge before she felt ready and was terrified of getting it wrong. 2 weeks earlier, a county health inspector had written the diner up because a customer's dog had been allowed inside, and Megan's manager had told her, in front of everyone, that if it happened again on her shift, it would be her job. She had a checklist in her head and a knot in her stomach, and when she saw a wheelchair roll through the door with a dog beside it, all she saw was the write-up, the threat, the rent. She did not see the vest. She did not see the man. She saw a problem. She moved to solve it, the only way her fear knew how. People will tell you cruelty comes from hate. More often, it comes from fear wearing a manager's apron. And Megan was about to learn what her fear had nearly let die. He'd gotten as far as a table near the window before she reached him. A waitress named Carla, 50-some years on her feet, had already set down a placemat and a coffee mug and crouched to say hello to the dog, because Carla had been at Rudy's 11 years and knew Earl by his order. Cheeseburger, no onion, water for the dog in the steel bowl they kept behind the counter just for him. Megan cut across the floor before the coffee was poured. "Sir, I'm sorry, you can't have a dog in here." Her voice was loud, pitched to carry, the way you talk when you're performing certainty you don't feel. Earl looked up at her, calm as still water. "He's a service animal, ma'am." He tapped the faded vest. "Trained and certified. He'll lie under the table. You won't know he's here." It was probably the longest string of words he'd say to a stranger all month. Megan shook her head before he finished. "I can't make exceptions. It's policy. No dogs." Carla straightened up. "Megan, it comes in all the—" "It's policy, Carla." The room had gone quiet the way rooms do when people are pretending not to listen. Earl did not argue. Was the thing that would haunt some of them later. The ones who replayed it. How he didn't argue. He'd argued with men who outranked him, once when arguing meant saving a life. And he'd learned the exact weight of his own words, and spent them like a man who'd been poor his whole life spends money. This wasn't worth them. He looked at Megan for a long second, not with anger, but with a kind of patience that was somehow worse than anger. Patience of a man who had been underestimated by people far more dangerous than a frightened girl in an apron. "All right," he said. 2 fingers moved to the dog's shoulder. A small touch, almost nothing, signal that meant with me. And Rook rose from the floor in one smooth motion and pressed to the wheel. Earl turned the chair. At the counter, the old man in the brown coat said, to nobody in particular but loud enough, "Can't just let dogs run around a restaurant." Couple of people chuckled. Earl kept rolling toward the door. And what none of them knew, not Megan, not Carla, not the man in the brown coat who'd just agreed he should go, was that the rule they were so proud of enforcing was about to fail in the worst way a rule can fail, and the only one in the building who could fix it was already halfway out the door. The man in the brown coat was named Walter Hayes. He was 71. A retired lineman for the power company, a widower, a regular who came in most days for coffee and the company of strangers, because his house had gotten too quiet since Ruth passed. He was not a cruel man. He was a tired man who agreed with, whoever spoke last, and he'd agreed with Megan because she was the one with the apron and the authority, and because it was easier than thinking. He had 2 sons. One of them lived 2 states away and called on Sundays. The other had gone into the Marine Corps at 19 and was somewhere Walter could never quite picture, and the not picturing was a low, constant ache he'd carried for years, the particular fear of a father whose child runs toward the things other people run from. Walter did not know, could not have known, that the man being wheeled toward the door had once, in a province on the other side of the world, refused to leave a wounded 19-year-old Marine in a ditch under fire. He did not know that Marine's name. He did not know it was his own, Port. Marcus was the son who'd gone into the Corps, and Walter had spent 4 years of deployment not sleeping right, watching the news he shouldn't have watched, learning the names of provinces he could not place on a map, because his boy was somewhere in them. When Marcus came home from that last tour different, quieter, with a scar along his ribs he wouldn't explain, and a stiffness in one leg, and a way of sitting with his back to the wall. Walter had asked, once, what had happened over there, and Marcus had said only, dog and a man I'll never be able to repay. Walter had assumed it was a figure of speech. He'd assumed a lot of things, the way fathers do when their children come back. Carrying weights they won't set down in front of them. He did not know that the dog had a name and the man had a name, and that both of them were, at that very moment, being escorted toward the exit of the diner where he sat drinking his coffee, agreeing with a manager he'd never see again, 4 minutes from the floor. It happened the way these things actually happen, which is to say without warning and without drama. Almost quietly, Walter set down his coffee cup. He started to say something else and didn't finish it. His face changed. Not a grimace, just a slackening, as if someone had loosened a screw behind his eyes, and his left hand rose halfway to his chest and stopped there. For a second, he looked merely puzzled. Then the stool tipped, and 71 years of a man went down sideways onto the checkered floor of Rudy's diner, and his coffee mug shattered, and the sound of it was the loudest thing the room had heard all day. Somebody screamed. Trucker half rose from his booth. Carla's hand flew to her mouth, and Megan, who was 3 semesters into nursing school, had a checklist in her head for exactly this. Froze. Her training emptied out of her in a single breath. She stood 6 feet from a dying man, with her hands open at her sides, and her mouth working and nothing. Coming out. The thing she had spent 2 years and money she didn't have learning to do, she could not do. Earl had already turned the chair. He'd heard the change in the room before the cup hit the floor. Heard it the way you hear weather coming. A pressure shift, wrongness, and his hand was already moving. But his hands were not what mattered now. He didn't reach for Walter. He couldn't have crossed the room fast enough. Not in the chair. Not with what was left of his legs. Instead, he did the only thing 8 years of war and 2 years of training had built him to do. He dropped his hand flat, palm down, snapped one word into the noise, low and absolute. A word in no language the diner spoke, but the only language that mattered. And the dog moved. Rook came off the wheel like something released from a held breath, crossed the diner in 3 strides. Between the chair legs, around the upended stool, past Megan's frozen body, and was on Walter before the broken mug had stopped spinning. What he did next, no one in that room would ever forget, because it was the most purposeful thing any of them had ever seen a living creature do, and they did not yet understand that they were watching a battlefield. Rook did not bark. Barking came later, in the sequence, only at the right time. First he found the face. He put his nose to Walter's slack mouth and held it there for 1 second, 2, reading the breath. And when the breath was wrong, he did the thing Earl had drilled into him 1,000 times on a gravel road. He turned his body, broadside, dropped his shoulder against Walter's chest, and pushed, rolling the limp weight off its face and onto its back so the airway would open. Then he planted his front paws on the man's sternum and pressed down hard with his whole weight, and released and pressed again. Not CPR. He was a dog. He couldn't know the count. But the rhythmic pressure was part of the sequence. The part that meant stay, part that in a collapsed compound in 2009 had kept a Marine's heart in his chest, long enough for the corpsman to arrive. And then, only then, lifted his head and began to bark. 3 sharp reports, a pause, 3 more, aimed not at the room but at Earl, the alert that in another country had meant casualty here. Alive, come now. It was a medevac call. It was 8 years old, and it was working. For one suspended second, nobody moved, because the human brain takes a beat to accept what it's seeing. Then Earl's voice cut the silence, once, and it was a different voice than the one that had said all right and rolled for the door. It was a command voice, dropped an octave, the voice of a man who had run triage under mortar fire, and it left no room for anyone to keep standing still. He's having a heart attack. Somebody call 911. Now. You, he pointed at the trucker. Get behind the counter. The AED's on the wall by the fire calendar. I saw it when I came in. You. At Carla. His collar. Open it. Get it loose. His eyes found Megan, frozen, ashen, useless. He did not yell at her, he said. Quiet and even, the way you talk a soldier through their first contact. Nursing student. I heard you tell him. You know how to do compressions. The dog's holding him. Now it's you. Get down here. And something in the way he said it. Not unkind, but absolute. Hand, reaching into the place where she'd locked up and turning the key, got her to her knees. The power in that room had just changed hands. Not one person had yet realized that the man giving the orders was the same man they'd thrown out. Megan dropped beside Walter. Hands were shaking. Rook lifted his paws off the man's chest the instant her hands came down, as if he'd been waiting to hand off the watch, back to precise 18 inches, and sat, ears forward, eyes locked on the old man, ready to go back in if she failed. She didn't fail. Training that had emptied out of her under panic came flooding back. The second she had a body under her hands, and a voice telling her she could, and she found the spot and laced her fingers and pressed, counting out loud, her voice cracking on the numbers. The trucker came running with the AED part. Earl talked them through the pads in the same flat, certain cadence, reading the machine's prompts before it spoke them, because he'd used a field version of the same device in places with no walls. Carla had Walter's collar open. Somewhere a phone was relaying the address to a dispatcher, and in the eye of all of it sat a wheelchair, and a man with no legs, running the whole room with his voice, and a dog, and, on the floor under a stranger's pumping hands, Walter Hayes's heart, which had stopped, stuttered, and caught. 3 minutes. That's how long it was from the shatter of the mug to the first wail of the siren turning off the interstate. Ramp, though to everyone in Rudy's it had been an hour and a heartbeat at once. When the paramedics came through the door with their bags and their gurney, they came into a scene that didn't compute. A young woman doing textbook compressions, an AED already attached and reading, dog sitting at a perfect alert 18 inches from the patient's head, and an old man in a wheelchair calling out the downtime and the rhythm like a man who'd done it 100 times. The lead medic, broad woman with grey at her temples, took one look and did something paramedics almost never do with a bystander. She listened to him. How long since he went down? 3 minutes, maybe less. Compressions started inside 90 seconds. One shock advised delivered. He had a pulse back before you came through that door. She nodded, and her crew moved, and Walter Hayes, alive, breathing, his heart beating in a rhythm the machine approved of, was lifted onto the gurney. And, as they worked, the diner's door opened again, and a man walked in, and the temperature of the room dropped 10 degrees, because everyone could feel before they understood that this was someone the moment had been waiting for. He was big, mid-30s, plain t-shirt and jeans, with a jaw like a cinder block and a high and tight that no civilian haircut ever quite imitates. He'd been 3 minutes away when the diner called the contact in Walter's phone listed as Marcus. In case, and he had driven those 3 minutes in a way that left rubber on the highway ramp. He came through the door already half broken with fear, scanning for his father, and he found him on the gurney, grey but alive, an oxygen mask fogging with breath, fear in his face cracked toward relief. And then it stopped. It stopped because his eyes, sweeping the room, snagged on a dog, sable Malinois, in a faded vest, sitting at parade-perfect alert beside the gurney, watching the medics work with the calm of a creature that had done this before. Marcus Hayes had spent 11 years in the Marine Corps. He knew exactly what he was looking at. And he knew, with a certainty that buckled his knees, that he had seen that posture, that vest, that exact sequence once before, on the worst day and the best day of his life. "Who?" Marcus said, and had to stop and start again. "Who does this dog belong to?" His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It had the particular gravel of a man used to being obeyed, and the room turned toward it the way iron filings turn toward a magnet. Megan, still on her knees, still shaking, pointed without a word at the wheelchair by the window. Marcus turned. He saw Earl. Saw the grey canvas jacket, the level chin, the 2 fingers resting again on the dog's shoulder, the legs that weren't there, and something moved across the big man's face that none of the diners had a name for, but that any Marine would have recognized at 50 yards. He crossed the room slowly. He crouched down in front of the wheelchair, bringing his eyes level with Earl's, and he looked at the brass tag, clipped inside the dog's faded vest, the tag worn smooth, the single word, the year, Duke 2004, and Marcus Hayes, who had buried friends and carried coffins, and not cried at any of it for years, put his hand over his mouth and made a sound like something breaking loose. "Master Sergeant Mercer." It wasn't a question. Earl went very still. "Do I know you, son?" Marcus shook his head, then nodded, then laughed, a wet wrecked sound. No, sir, you don't know me, but I know you, known your name for 16 years. He pointed at the dog, at the tag, his hand unsteady. "That's Duke's vest. That's Duke's tag. Duke's been gone 3 years, Earl said quietly. "This is Rook. I trained him myself. I know what you trained him to do." Marcus's voice broke wide open now, and he didn't fight it, didn't care who saw. "I know the sequence, the roll, the chest, 3 and 3 bark. I know it because I watched a dog named Duke do it to me. October 9th, 2009. Panjwai district, 19 years old, and I was bleeding out, under a wall that came down on a patrol, and everybody said, 'Leave him. The area's not secure. Leave the kid.' And one handler didn't leave. One handler crawled in with his dog under fire, and that dog found me and did that." He jabbed a finger, floor where Walter had lain. "Exactly that, and kept me alive until the corpsman got there. Whole diner had gone so silent you could hear the AED's standby tone. That handler was you, that dog was Duke, and the Marine you saved." He looked toward the gurney, toward the grey-faced old man being wheeled toward the doors, and his voice finally failed him completely. "That's my father on that stretcher. You saved my life 16 years ago. Your dog just saved my dad." The room did not gasp. It was past gasping. It had gone into that rare suspended silence that falls when ordinary people realize they have been standing in the middle of something enormous and mistook it for a Tuesday. Carla was crying openly. The trucker had taken off his cap, and Earl Mercer, who had said almost nothing all afternoon, who had let himself be called a problem and a rule breaker, and been wheeled toward a door without a word of protest. Earl Mercer reached out and put a hand on the young man's shoulder, the same gesture, the exact gesture, that he used on the dog, the one that meant with me, "You're not alone, I've got you." "Hayes," he said softly, the name surfacing out of 16 years like a stone out of deep water. "Lance Corporal Hayes. You had a picture of a girl in your helmet. Wouldn't stop talking even with a wall on top of you. I told you if you didn't shut up, I'd leave you there." Marcus laughed and sobbed at once. "You told me Marines don't quit, and neither do their dogs." "And you didn't," Earl said. Neither did he. Now the story moved fast, the way it does once the truth is out, and there's no putting it back. The lead paramedic, who had paused at the door with the gurney to listen, came back across the room and crouched by the wheelchair too, and she said plainly, "Sir, I've been doing this 22 years. That dog ran a better primary survey than half the people I've trained. If he hadn't rolled that man off his face and kept that chest moving, we'd be working a different call right now. You understand me? Your dog bought us the only 3 minutes that mattered." She stood, and she looked at the faded vest, and then a thing she would not have been able to explain afterward. She came to attention and held it, just for a second, before she wheeled Walter Hayes out into the light and the waiting ambulance, alive. And as the doors swung shut behind the gurney, every eye in Rudy's diner turned. Slowly, terribly, toward the young manager still kneeling on the floor where she'd done the compressions, the young manager who 20 minutes ago had said no dogs, no exceptions, loud enough for the whole room to hear. Megan Doss could not get up. She knelt there with her hands open in her lap, the hands that had just helped keep a man alive, and she looked at the dog she had tried to throw out. The enormity of it came down on her all at once. If Earl had argued, if he'd been a different kind of man, the kind who made a scene, refused to leave, who waited for the police, she'd have called. He'd have been out in the parking lot by the time Walter fell. The dog would have been with him. Walter Hayes would have died on the floor of Rudy's diner with a nursing student standing frozen 6 feet away, and the only reason he hadn't was that the man she'd humiliated had chosen, even on his way out the door, even rejected, to turn his chair around at the first sign of trouble, instead of rolling away into the afternoon he was owed. She understood, kneeling there, that her rule had nearly killed a man, and that the thing she'd been afraid of, a dog in her diner, was the only thing in the building that had known what to do, including her. She started to speak. Her voice wouldn't come. She tried again, and what came out was small and broken, and the only thing left to say, "I'm so sorry." And the man in the wheelchair, who had every right in the world to let her drown in it, did not. "Look at me," Earl said. She did. "What's your name?" "Megan." "Megan. You did good compressions just now. You froze and then you didn't, and the second part is the only part that counts. You hear me?" She shook her head, refusing the mercy. "I told you to leave. I know what you almost." His voice was not soft now. It was honest, which is harder. "Fear's a liar. It told you a vest on a dog was a threat to your job. It told a lot of people a lot of worse things in a lot of worse places than this. But you got something most people don't get. Megan, you got to find out today, while there's still time to do something with it. Most folks never find out what their fear nearly cost them. You did. Now you carry that, and you let it make you better than you were this morning. You do not." His eyes flicked to the faded sign by the door. "Everyone's welcome," going grey, back to her face. "You do not ever again look at a person and see a problem instead of a person. That's the whole lesson. That's the only one." She nodded and kept nodding, and Carla came and helped her stand. And somewhere in that standing up, a different woman got to her feet than the one knelt down. Walter Hayes lived. The cardiac team at County put 2 stents in a 90% blockage that the doctors said, flatly, killed him on any other afternoon in any other room. And 3 days later he was sitting up in a hospital bed, demanding to know when he could have a cheeseburger. Marcus barely left his side, and on the second day he brought someone to meet his father. He wheeled Earl Mercer into the room himself, and Rook walked beside the chair in his faded vest, and Walter Hayes, who had nodded along when a frightened girl told a hero to get out, looked at the dog that had pushed his chest until his heart restarted and could not speak for a long time. When he finally could, all he managed was, "I told them to put you out." Earl shook his head. "Told them what you'd been told." Everybody in that room did. Walter reached out a shaking hand, not to Earl, but to the dog, Rook, stepped forward and put his head under it. And the old man wept into the fur of an animal he'd helped exile. And the animal let him. There are debts that can't be balanced, only witnessed. This was one. The thing about a story like this is that it does not stay in one diner. Trucker had filmed the last 90 seconds on his phone. Not the cruelty he'd been eating, but the dog, the compressions, the old man in the chair calling out commands. And he posted it that night with a caption that just said, I don't have words. By the weekend it had been watched 11 million times. The local paper ran it, and then a bigger one, Porter, found the part nobody had filmed. That the dog and the man had been turned away minutes before, the rule had nearly cost the life it then saved. People wanted to make Megan a villain. Earl wouldn't let them. He gave exactly one interview, porch of his 2-steep ramp with Rook at his feet. And when the reporter pushed him about the manager, he said she was a kid doing a hard job scared. And she got down on that floor and did compressions when it counted. And she's going to be a hell of a nurse. Print that. Don't print the other thing. They printed it. It became the part everyone shared. The diner's owner, a man named Dale, who'd inherited the place from the original Rudy and run it absently for years from a recliner in the back office, drove down the morning. The video crossed 1 million views to find a line out the door of people who wanted to eat where it had happened. He could have leaned into that. Some men would have. Instead he sat in a back booth with Earl for an hour, and whatever passed between them, Dale came out of that booth a different owner. He took the corkboard down off the wall and threw away the business cards. Nobody had called in a decade. He had the old painted sign by the door cleaned and sealed, so the letters would stop going grey, and he did the thing that mattered most. Kid yarned. He found Megan in the kitchen, where she'd been hiding from the cameras and the comments, and he did not fire her, which she'd been certain he would, which a part of her had decided she deserved. He told her she'd kept her head when it counted, and frozen when it didn't, and that the difference between a bad nurse and a good one was learning which was which, and that he expected to see her name on a hospital badge inside 2 years. Then he made her assistant manager, because the woman who had nearly thrown a hero out the door was now, he figured, the last person on Earth who would ever do it again. He was right about that too. The Marine Corps League found Earl, because of course they did, and learned what the records had quietly held for years, that Master Sergeant Earl Mercer had served 8 years as a military working dog handler in and around Kandahar, that he had a Silver Star and a Bronze Star with a V. For valour he had never once mentioned to a soul in Calhoun County, that he had lost both legs below the knee to an IED in 2011, 18 months after he crawled under fire to pull a screaming 19-year-old named Marcus Hayes out from under a wall, and that he had spent the years since living quietly on a gravel road, training a puppy to remember a thing the world had asked him to forget. They wanted to give him a dinner. He declined. They wanted to put him on a stage. He declined that too. What he accepted, finally, after Marcus asked him personally, was a small ceremony at the VFW where they gave Rook a vest of his own, a new one, properly fitted, which Earl thanked them for and then folded carefully and set aside, because Rook would keep wearing dukes, and everybody who knew the story understood why, and everybody who didn't would learn. Megan Doss finished her nursing degree the following spring. She had told that story in her clinical interview. The one she wasn't supposed to be able to tell without crying, and couldn't. Panel had hired her anyway, maybe because of it. She works the cardiac floor at County now, the same floor where Walter Hayes got his stents, and there is a thing she does that her co-workers have noticed and asked about. When a patient's family is being difficult, somebody's being written off as a problem in a hallway. Megan is the one who stops and goes back and sees the person. She has a photograph in her locker. It's not of the dog. It's of a hand-painted sign going grey. 4 words. Everyone's welcome. That she took down off the wall at Rudy's, with the owner's permission, and had restored and rehung by the door, where it is read now, every day, by everyone who comes in. She put it back up herself. It was the first thing she did when they made her the manager. Rudy's changed its policy that same week. There's a new sign by the door under the old painted one, smaller, that says, Service Animals. Always welcome. Beneath it, in a frame Carla hung, is a photograph of a sable Malinois in a faded vest lying under a window table, printout of the 11th of the month order. Cheeseburger, no onion, water for the dog, that the staff now keeps ready, 'cause Earl Mercer still comes in on the 11th every month and rolls to the same table by the window, and nobody asks him to leave. They couldn't if they tried. Walter Hayes meets him there now. The 2 old men eat cheeseburgers and don't say much, which is how old men who understand each other prefer it. And the dog lies between their feet with his chin on Earl's boot, on the prosthetic foot that can't feel it. And Earl rests 2 fingers on the dog's shoulder out of habit, the way he has for 16 years across 2 dogs and 1 war. The small touch that means with me. Earl never did tell anyone the whole of it. What those 8 years cost, what he saw, the names he carries, the reason a man teaches a puppy a medevac call on a gravel road 3 years after the last war he'll ever fight. He doesn't need to. You can see most of it if you watch him with the dog for 5 minutes. The discipline worn into the shape of him, the way he spends his words like a poor man, spends money, the tremor in his left hand that has nothing to do with age. He was a man the whole world was built to overlook, old, disabled, quiet, nobody. And he turned out to be the only one in the room who could save a life, because he'd spent his whole life learning how, and never once asked to be thanked for it. That's what they almost threw out the door. That's what dogs, no exceptions, nearly cost. And the only reason it didn't is that a man with no legs turned his chair around when he heard a stranger fall. So here's the thing to carry out of this one, the way Megan carries it down a cardiac hallway every shift. The people the world is quickest to dismiss. The old, the broken down, the quiet ones who don't make a scene, are so often the ones carrying the most, having given the most, asking for the least. A vest you can barely read, a tremor that isn't age, a word in a language you don't speak that turns a dog into a marine. You will not always know who is sitting across the diner from you. You will almost never know what they've done, or what they could do, or what they've already survived. So you give them the table, you give everyone the table. If this story moved you, if you believe a quiet man's service is worth more than a loud man's rule, subscribe, and stay with us. Because there are more of these heroes out there than you'd ever guess. Sitting in wheelchairs by windows, asking for nothing, and they deserve to be seen. Type Semper Fi below for Earl and Rook. We'll see you on the next one.